Kelly Clayton was a devoted mother who lived in a quiet neighborhood in upstate New York. She was known for her vibrant personality, her love of horses, and her deep devotion to her two children. To the outside world, her life seemed picture perfect. She was married to Thomas Clayton, a former professional hockey player who was well liked in the community. Together, they appeared to have built a happy and comfortable life. Friends admired them, neighbors saw them as an ideal couple, and no one could have predicted the darkness that would soon shatter their world. On the night of September 29, 2015, everything changed. The quiet town was about to witness a crime, so brutal that it would haunt its residents for years. Around midnight, a frantic 911 call came in. The caller was Thomas Clayton, and his voice was shaking with panic as he reported that he had just come home to a horrifying scene. He claimed that he had been out playing poker with friends and returned home to find his wife unresponsive, lying in a pool of blood. When authorities arrived, they were met with a gruesome sight. Kelly's lifeless body was sprawled on the bedroom floor, her face and head covered in blood. The crime scene was disturbing. There were clear signs of a violent struggle. Blood was smeared on the walls, and the force used against her suggested uncontrollable rage. However, something seemed strange. The rest of the house was undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing appeared stolen, and the doors were locked. It didn't look like a typical home invasion. Detectives carefully examined the area, taking note of every detail. The couple's two young children were found unharmed in another room, seemingly unaware of what had transpired just feet away from them. It was a devastating reality. Their mother had been brutally murdered while they slept. Officers questioned Thomas immediately. He repeated his story, insisting that he had been out with friends all evening and had walked into the horror upon his return. He appeared shaken, pacing back and forth as officers took his statement. Despite his distressed demeanor, something felt off to investigators. The crime was personal, filled with raw violence, yet there were no clear indications of a robbery or a random break-in. The precision with which Kelly had been attacked, combined with the fact that nothing was missing, led detectives to consider another disturbing possibility. Was this an act of someone close to her? News of Kelly's death spread quickly throughout the town, leaving friends and family in complete shock. Everyone who knew her struggled to comprehend how something so tragic could happen to someone so full of life. Those who had seen her just days before recalled her smiling, making plans for the future and doting on her children. No one could understand who would want to harm her, let alone in such a brutal manner. As investigators began piecing together the details of that night, they turned their attention to something unexpected: the couple's 7-year-old daughter. What she would reveal would become the first chilling clue in uncovering a truth more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Kelly Clayton's murder was still in its early stages when detectives decided to speak with the only other people in the house that night, her two young children. The 7-year-old daughter and her younger sibling had been found unharmed in their rooms, seemingly asleep when the crime occurred. Investigators knew that children could be unreliable witnesses, but they also understood that kids often noticed things adults didn't. If Kelly's daughter had been awake at any point that night, she might hold a vital clue. As gently as possible, a child specialist was brought in to speak with her. At first, the little girl seemed confused, struggling to understand why so many strangers were in her house. She knew something terrible had happened, but no one had told her the full truth. Slowly, the specialist asked if she had heard or seen anything unusual during the night. The child hesitated, her small hands fidgeting as she tried to recall the details. Then, in a quiet voice, she said something that sent a shiver through the room. She had woken up. The sounds had startled her. Loud noises, like someone moving, quickly, something crashing, and then silence. She had peeked out of her room, scared but curious. In the dim light, she saw a figure in the hallway, a man. She couldn't see his face clearly, but something about him felt familiar. When asked to describe him, she hesitated before saying something chilling. "He looked like my daddy." The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. They had no intention of jumping to conclusions based solely on a child's statement, but her words could not be ignored. Could she have mistaken another man for her father? Could fear have clouded her memory? These questions lingered in the air, but one thing was now certain. Thomas Clayton's alibi needed to be scrutinized more closely. Thomas had been cooperative from the start, providing a detailed timeline of his evening. He claimed to have spent the night at a friend's house playing poker. Several witnesses, including his friends, had backed up his story, stating that he had been with them until around midnight. But now, investigators needed to verify every detail with precision. As they began tracing his movements, they discovered an unsettling inconsistency. One of the poker game attendees mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Thomas had left the gathering for a short period before returning. No one had thought much of it at the time. People often stepped outside to take calls or get fresh air. But now, that small window of time took on a sinister significance. Security footage from a nearby gas station provided another clue. At a time when Thomas should have still been at the poker game, a car matching his was seen near his home. It was a small detail, but one that placed him far closer to the crime scene than he had originally claimed. As these unsettling discoveries piled up, investigators began to wonder, had Thomas orchestrated the crime himself? Or was there someone else involved? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but the full picture was far darker than anyone had expected. As detectives continued investigating Kelly Clayton's murder, the focus shifted more intensely toward Thomas Clayton. His alibi, once considered airtight, was now riddled with inconsistencies. The claim that he had been at a poker game all night was partially true, but the new evidence suggested he had left the gathering at some point, and no one could account for his whereabouts during that critical time. The security footage showing a car similar to his near the Clayton home was another red flag. But the biggest turning point came when investigators uncovered a series of phone calls Thomas had made in the weeks leading up to Kelly's murder. Digging into his phone records, authorities discovered multiple calls between Thomas and a man named Michael Beard. Beard was a former employee of Thomas's business, a man who had once worked for him but had recently fallen on hard times. Investigators quickly learned that Beard had been struggling financially and had lost his job. When they looked into his background, they found something even more troubling. Beard had a history of run-ins with the law. He wasn't a hardened criminal, but he was certainly someone who might be willing to take desperate measures for money. As investigators pieced together the connection between Thomas and Beard, they found even more damning evidence. Witnesses revealed that Thomas had been complaining about his marriage for months. He had told several people that he was unhappy and wanted out, but divorce wasn't something he was willing to consider. Friends recalled him saying that separating from Kelly would be too costly, and he didn't want to lose control over their finances. These statements, combined with Kelly's sizable life insurance policy, painted a chilling motive. If Kelly was gone, Thomas would inherit everything. Authorities brought Beard in for questioning, and at first, he denied any involvement. He claimed he had no knowledge of the crime and had no reason to harm Kelly. But as detectives applied pressure, inconsistencies in his story began to emerge. When confronted with the phone records showing multiple calls between him and Thomas, Beard became visibly nervous. Then, investigators found something even more shocking. Records showed that Beard had been in the vicinity of the Clayton home on the night of the murder. Faced with mounting evidence, Beard finally cracked. In a chilling confession, he admitted that Thomas had hired him to kill Kelly. The plan had been simple. Thomas would create an alibi by staying at the poker game while Beard broke into the house and staged a robbery gone wrong. In exchange, Thomas had promised him a substantial payout. But what was supposed to be a quick job had turned into a gruesome and violent attack. With Beard's confession, investigators now had the final piece they needed. Thomas Clayton, the dubious man who had called 911 sounding frantic and grief-stricken, had in fact been the mastermind behind his own wife's brutal murder. His poker night alibi had been nothing more than a carefully planned cover, and the murder of Kelly Clayton had been a cold-blooded scheme driven by greed. With Michael Beard's confession, the case against Thomas Clayton became undeniable. What at first seemed like a tragic home invasion gone wrong was now exposed as a calculated murder-for-hire plot. Investigators wasted no time building their case, gathering every piece of evidence that linked Thomas to the crime. Phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Thomas had planned his wife's murder with precision, ensuring that he had a seemingly solid alibi while another man carried out the brutal attack. Detectives reviewed Beard's confession carefully, making sure it aligned with the evidence they had collected. According to Beard, Thomas had approached him weeks before the murder with an offer of money in exchange for killing Kelly. Thomas had painted a picture of a miserable marriage, telling Beard that he was trapped and needed a way out. Divorce was not an option. He didn't want to risk losing his assets or his control over their children. The solution in his mind was simple. Kelly had to die. Beard had agreed, believing he would receive a large payout for his role. On the night of the murder, he had entered the Clayton home while Thomas was at his poker game, just as planned. But what was supposed to be a staged robbery quickly turned into something far more violent. Kelly had fought back, and Beard had responded with sheer brutality. By the time he left, she was unrecognizable. Her injuries so severe that investigators initially struggled to determine the weapon used. As the case moved forward, forensic evidence continued to strengthen the prosecution's argument. A key piece of clothing found at the crime scene contained traces of Beard's DNA, confirming his presence in the house. Additionally, security cameras in the area captured footage of a car similar to Beard's near the Clayton residence around the estimated time of the murder. These details, combined with the confession, left no doubt. Beard had been the one to carry out the killing, but he hadn't acted alone. Thomas maintained his innocence, refusing to admit any involvement. He insisted that he had nothing to do with his wife's death, portraying himself as a grieving husband who had come home to a nightmare. His defense team argued that Beard had acted on his own, possibly targeting Kelly for reasons unrelated to Thomas. But the overwhelming evidence told a different story. The frequent calls between the two men before the murder, the financial records showing Beard's desperation for money, and Thomas's own statements about wanting out of his marriage all pointed to one conclusion: he had orchestrated the crime. As the trial approached, Kelly's family and friends braced themselves for the difficult road ahead. The man they had once trusted, the father of Kelly's children, was now being revealed as the mastermind behind her death. It was a betrayal beyond comprehension. But as painful as the truth was, they were determined to see justice served. The law, evidence was there, and now it was up to the court to decide the fate of the man who had destroyed his own family for money and control. The courtroom was packed as the trial of Thomas Clayton and Michael Beard began. The case had gripped the small community, turning what was once considered a tragic home invasion into a chilling tale of betrayal and greed. Kelly Clayton's family and friends sat in the gallery, their faces filled with sorrow and determination. They were there for justice, knowing that no verdict could ever bring Kelly back, but hoping that the man responsible for her death would never walk free again. Prosecutors presented a meticulous case against Thomas. They laid out the series of events that led to Kelly's murder, proving that it was not a random act of violence, but a carefully planned execution. They played recordings of Thomas's phone calls with Michael Beard, showing how the two men had communicated multiple times in the weeks leading up to the crime. They revealed financial records that painted a clear motive. Thomas was drowning in financial struggles and saw Kelly's life insurance policy as his way out. Testimony from friends and associates further damaged his case, as they recalled Thomas's frequent complaints about his marriage and his reluctance to go through a costly divorce. Michael Beard, already convicted for his role in the murder, was now a key part of the trial. His confession had been damning, and although he later tried to retract parts of it, the damage had already been done. His DNA at the crime scene, along with surveillance footage linking him to the area that night, was undeniable. The defense attempted to argue that Beard had acted alone, that he had personal reasons for targeting Kelly, and that Thomas had nothing to do with it. But the jury saw through the lies. The evidence was too strong, and the prosecution's argument was airtight. This was a murder for hire, and Thomas was the mastermind. Throughout the trial, Thomas sat emotionless. He barely reacted as witnesses took the stand, as prosecutors described in detail the brutal way Kelly had died. Even when his own daughter's testimony was brought up, the innocent statement from a 7-year-old who had unknowingly revealed the truth, he remained cold and expressionless. It was a stark contrast to the grief-stricken faces of Kelly's loved ones, who wept silently as the horrifying details of her final moments were recounted in court. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. Thomas Clayton was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs and relieved embraces as the judge handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice had been served. As Thomas was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his betrayal hung heavy in the air. He had orchestrated the murder of his own wife, the mother of his children, all for money and control. But in the end, his plan had unraveled, exposing the depths of his cruelty. Kelly's family took solace in knowing that he would never be able to harm anyone again. The scars of that night would never fade. But at least now, there was closure.